Morning, everyone. Fantastic to see you all. Welcome to the RSA. Welcome to the Great Room, which I think you'll agree is pretty great. I'm Andy Haldane. I'm a Chief Executive here at the RSA, and a very, very warm welcome to our special guest and speaker today, Sir Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor. Thank you. Do you usually get 2 rounds of applause before you've even spoken a word?
Well, it's a bit light, actually. It's normally a bit more than that, but still, never mind.
You lot can come again. Listen, we all know we've been living through subpar growth for, approaching 20 years now. We also know that successive governments of every hue, including the current one, has committed to turning the fortunes on growth and lifting living standards. But here we are, approaching 2 lost decades for living standards, right? And my sense would be that when it comes to the hunt for the holy grail of growth, we're still hunting. We have yet to find a real lasting, plausible solution. And that's a pretty sobering backdrop, and the backdrop internationally is no less sobering. We have, over the course of this year, shifted from a Newtonian world of risk, to a quantum world of deep and lasting uncertainty. And that uncertainty, of course, is itself a further headwind to living standards and to growth. And it was Einstein, one of the pioneers, of course, of quantum dynamics, who said that you simply cannot solve the problems of today with the level of thinking that created those problems in the first place. If ever there were a time for fresh thinking backed up by purposive action at scale, then it is now. It needs to be now. And that's why, having set that challenge, Mel, I can only say how pleased I am that you are rising to it rather than me over the course of your speech. And with that, please join me in welcoming to the stage Sir Mel Stride.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy. Thanks very much. Thank you. Well, Andy, thank you very much for setting the scene so well and for your introduction and for hosting me today. Today, my party is in a difficult place. Many have lost trust in us, and many are right to be angry. For some Conservatives, our predicament has understandably led to immediate pressures for quick answers, actions promptly to restore our fortunes. But whilst we must strain every sinew to snap back to where we want to be, we should also recognise that this will take time. That is not to say that we should not be vigorous in the present, far from it. We must always strive to run faster in holding the government to account, expressing our conservative values, and yes, when the timing is right, coming forward with policies as we have been. But the reasons people have lost trust in us, especially on the economy, are deep-seated and cannot be swept away with quick fixes. The public want to know that their government will act responsibly, and they want to know it will deliver a prosperous future for our economy and for them and for their family. On much of that, the Conservative Party has seemed to have failed. So I want today to be crystal clear that I recognise those frustrations. Indeed, I share them. And my party cannot begin to win back the public's trust until we have shown we understand their disappointment and their anger, and show that we have changed. The clearest example of that, in the minds of many, is what happened in the autumn of 2022. For a few weeks, we put at risk the very stability which Conservatives have always said must be carefully protected. The credibility of the UK's economic framework was undermined by spending billions on subsidising energy bills and tax cuts with no proper plan for how this would be paid for. As a Conservative, of course, I want taxes to be as low as possible, but that must be achieved responsibly through fiscal discipline. Back then, mistakes were recognised and stability restored within weeks, with the full backing of my party. But the damage to our credibility is not so easily undone. That will take time, and it also requires contrition. So let me be clear. Never again will the Conservative Party undermine fiscal credibility by making promises that we cannot afford. And as Kenny says, we will always start with a credible, fully funded plan. But that moment was also in part born of exasperation with the failure of successive governments to put us on a path back to sustained growth and rising living standards. There is an enduring frustration with stagnation. The fact is, for a large swathe of the population, our economy simply has not been working for them for some considerable time. Incomes have stagnated. Many feel that the system only works for the benefit of others, for large corporations or people from other countries, but not for them and their families. We must accept that for too long, governments of both colours have failed to free us from this malaise. For my party, to find a path back to regaining trust, we must show that we are serious about listening to people and creating a better future underpinned by a credible plan. If we do not, then we risk the same mistakes happening all over again. Because Keir Starmer and Nigel Farage are not offering the stability and responsibility that is needed. Nor do they have the answers to the tough underlying issues which have been holding our economy back. So I also want to challenge you, all of you today, to take the time to consider economic arguments more deeply, and to do so with everything you hear from politicians of all parties. Our modern digital age has many advantages, but in some ways it has ushered in the death of what we might call the age of thoughtfulness, by which I mean the careful consideration of arguments in order to establish the truth. In a world of 24-hour news on the go and social media, we don't stop to think things through like we used to. Audiences are increasingly attracted to the fleeting sparkle of the novel or shocking or celebrity, or in some cases simply the fake. And that risks allowing attractive but shallow arguments to take hold. Populists, in particular, claim there are easy answers to our problems, telling voters what they want to hear without any credible plan as to how they might deliver. Take reform. Their economic prescription is pure populism. It doubles down on the magic money tree we thought we had banished with Jeremy Corbyn. They would plough ahead with huge additional welfare spending, as well as tax cuts, with no plan for how to pay for any of it. We must be radical in our prospectus, but we must be grounded in the principles of stability and responsibility. And as Kemi has said, and she will be saying more about this next week, politicians more generally have not been honest about the depths of the problems we face and what is needed in order to address them. And that is what has driven disillusionment with an economy that for many has simply failed to deliver for far too long. What I will argue today is that we must be guided by two overarching priorities. First, ensuring economic stability as the prerequisite for protecting the nation's finances and keeping taxes low. Responsible public finances with control of spending and deep reforms to our public services and our welfare system to make them work better. And secondly, completely rewiring our economy and the state to jumpstart economic growth, ripping up the thicket of regulation and barriers that are holding back British enterprise and initiative, not piling on additional burdens as this government is doing. and weaning our economy off its over-reliance on the state. Any one of these priorities alone won't be enough to deliver a stronger economy, the economy that the British people expect. Forget any of them, and our future is put at risk. They will work all together or not at all. Economic stability must come first above everything else. We've seen too often the terrible consequences for our economy and society when that lesson is forgotten. In a world of high government debt and high interest burdens, our public finances face greater challenges and risks at any time since the global financial crisis. Financial markets around the world are growing increasingly concerned about governments' borrowing plans and are charging higher interest rates to lend to them, especially at the longer maturities that have for so long been a source of strength and stability for the UK's public finances. In the decade after 2010, Conservative-led governments rescued our public finances and our reputation from the biggest budget deficit in the G20, the worst public finances in our post-war history, a clear and present danger to our economy. Going into the pandemic, we had completely eliminated the current budget deficit, and the debt-to-GDP ratio had begun to fall. It's only because of that bold action to repair the public finances that we were able to act with such speed and confidence when COVID threatened our economy and the Russian invasion of Ukraine threatened our energy security. The mini-budget of September 2022 undermined those stable foundations we had built, and we will never allow that to happen again. Sadly, while the Conservatives have recommitted to fiscal responsibility and economic stability, the other parties are abandoning them. By fiddling the figures, and alone amongst the OECD countries, changing her definition of national debt, Rachel Reeves has presented to the world a forecast with our standard debt-to-GDP ratio continuing to rise over the whole of that period. She has the gall to claim she has brought stability and balanced the books when the OBR themselves have said she would be breaking the fiscal rules which were followed by her predecessor. By borrowing hundreds of billions more than the plans she inherited and pushing up the rates we pay on that borrowing, Rachel Reeves has added nearly 80 billion to our expected debt interest bill over the course of this Parliament alone. At the spending review next week, we can expect her to trumpet all of the additional projects and programmes that she is funding, without mentioning the fact that it is all being paid for from borrowing. And that is before we consider the impact of other recent moves. Take welfare as just one example. The Labour Party are U-turning on their own welfare savings without any way to plug the hole that leaves in our public finances. Meanwhile, Reform are pledging to abolish the two-child cap in our welfare system that saves billions in welfare payments every year. Of all the other OECD countries, only France, Belgium and the United States have a similar projection for rising debt. And the UK doesn't have the leeway currently available to the US with the dollar as the world's reserve currency. That's just too big a risk to take with our economy. No wonder the OECD warned this week that the Chancellor's left far too little headroom against her fiscal rules, and the IMF warned against any loosening of fiscal policy. Reform would go even further, pledging tens of billions in unfunded tax cuts and spending commitments. They're not even trying to make their sums add up, while hoping that frustrated voters simply won't notice. Both are peddling a prospectus which will only leave us with higher debts and undermine confidence in our ability to repay them. They are both a clear and present threat to our economy. Only Kemi Badenoch and the Conservatives have spoken up for taxpayers and the public finances, defending the two-child cap, pushing Labour to be bolder on welfare reform. And we must demonstrate that we will be responsible. But we must also show we are not still committed to the same old approaches which left our economy languishing in the economic slow lane. That means building a plan for a radical rewiring of our economy. Now, rewirings have been achieved before, on at least 2 occasions since 1945. The first was the post-war Attlee government. The second, the Thatcher reforms of the 1980s. The Thatcher revolution is instructive for today's challenges. The 1970s saw stagflation, rising unemployment, recession, and ultimately the winter of discontent. In response, the 1980s saw a free market revolution driven by privatization, deregulation, lower and reformed taxes, a fostering of the entrepreneurial spirit, and a smaller state. Crucially, as the economic model shifted, far more people were able to feel that the new order was benefiting them directly. An era often referred to as popular capitalism was born. And in the decades that followed, we gradually caught up with our European peers. Then crisis hit. The global financial crisis of 2008 is an inflection point, representing the pivot between the higher and lower productivity growth, and so the start of a sustained downwards path to economic weakness. Before 2008, trend growth in GDP per capita was around 2%. According to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, if that had continued today, we would have been producing around £47,000 of output per person. Instead, it's just reached £37,000, a full £10,000 per head lower than where the pre-2008 trend would have taken us. And what does all this mean for people's lives? Well, in terms of the average British worker, as Andy said, they're no better off now than they were in 2008. Average living standards in our country are around those of the poorest US state, Mississippi. Some estimates suggest that average incomes in Poland will exceed those in the United Kingdom by as early as 2035. Since the music stopped in 2008, we have become relatively poorer. And governments, including Conservative governments, have not broken that cycle. And our failure to address productivity and growth means that we carry greater risks as a country and a lower likelihood of meeting the variety of critical challenges that we face. In a world which is increasingly less secure and in which the support of the United States cannot be taken for granted, we will need higher defence spending. Domestically, we have an ageing population, increasing pressure on health, social care, and pensions. There is the challenge of intergenerational fairness with younger age groups, doubting that they will ever be as well off as their parents. Amongst many young people, there is a profound sense of dislocation from what our country has to offer. And certainly, when it comes to the Conservative Party, young voters have simply stopped listening to us. The average age of a Conservative voter at the last election was 63 years old. Addressing these challenges will need new approaches in a number of policy areas, but nothing will be resolved without a higher growth economy. We can no longer afford the managerial incrementalism of the past. We now need to be truly radical. But we also need to be honest about there being no quick fixes. Honest about the fact that the challenges that are holding us back are very, very significant. Take energy, for example. Overall, UK electricity supply has declined since the mid-2000s and prices have risen. We have halved the electricity we generate through nuclear power, surely one of the greatest strategic errors our governments have made over recent generations. The UK now has the highest industrial electricity prices of any member of the International Energy Agency, 50% higher than France or Germany, and an astonishing 4 times higher than the United States or Canada. This is not just a problem for heavy industry. It also affects our ability to build the large energy-hungry data centres essential for modern artificial intelligence. So we must develop a plan that can move us to having amongst the most secure and competitive energy in the world. Or take our housing and planning system. As noted in the excellent foundations paper last year by Bowman, Hughes and Southwood, France has a similar population to the United Kingdom at 7 million more homes. Not only is our consistent failure to build the homes we need leading to sky-high prices and rents, it's also restraining productive cities like Cambridge. And while we typically focus on whether governments are hitting their housing targets, we rarely scrutinise whether those targets themselves are adequate. The 300,000 per year target, so embedded in our housing discourse, was based on an analysis which assumed a net migration level of 170,000 per year, whereas recently that figure has been nudging towards 1 million. So the story on housing is as much about bringing down net migration as it is about increasing supply, and we must do both. And it is not just housing, but infrastructure, with projects often running behind schedule and over budget. To simply get from the point of proposal to the start of construction, Hinkley Point C took 10 years. The travails of HS2 are perhaps the most well-documented recent example of a major project oscillating between the exorbitant and the completely impossible, including the infamous Bat Tunnel at a cost of £120 million. Perhaps it would have been better to have booked the bats into Claridge's and tucked them up in their little bat beds with their bat butlers to look after them, and to have saved over 100 million quid in the process. Well, you get the idea. And whilst we were going batty, the Chinese built the super-fast railway between Beijing and Shanghai in just 3 years. So our plan was rewire planning, including infrastructure. On regulation more generally, we have seen mission creep by regulators to an explosion of red tape. Take financial services. The ratio of regulators to financial services workers increased from 1 to 11,000 in 1980, to 1 to 300 in 2011, and to 1 to just 75 today. And for all Labour's rhetoric, they are piling on more regulations and red tape, including through their Employment Rights Bill. So our plan must show that there are better trade-offs to be had around regulation, risk and return. And then there is the tax burden, which continues to rise, moving much higher than the US and other dynamic economies like Singapore. A lower tax economy can mean better returns on investment, better work incentives, and can lower the long-term cost of capital. We need to look at every one of our taxes and reliefs and ask whether they could be doing more to lean into growth. And we need to reform our financial services and pensions and savings space so that people secure a decent income on retirement and investment is more available for scale-ups and for infrastructure. So we are setting up policy commissions on both taxation and on finance and the city, which will look in great depth at precisely these issues. Now, having served as Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, I have seen up close our broken and hugely costly welfare system. 1 in 10 working people now claim a health-related benefit. Total expenditure on benefits for people with health conditions and disabilities is forecast to be 60% higher in real terms by the end of this decade than it was before the pandemic, meaning an increase in costs of £40 billion. Reform is difficult, but the prize can be huge. Just one single reform alone during my time at DWP, that of the Work Capability Assessment, saw the OBR reduce their estimate of welfare spending across the forecast by £5 billion. So we will work on further fair and principled reforms to control welfare spending. And we have a bloated state. The civil service has grown by 1/3 since 2016. So we will generate a plan to slash bureaucracy. Our vision may not see me brandishing a chainsaw, but our ambition will be vast. And productivity in the public sector, in particular, is far too low. In the case of the health service, it has gone backwards since the pandemic. So we will do the hard thinking around the reform of public services and challenge the lazy assumption that getting more out always requires putting ever more cash in. So what approach should we take to finding answers? In short, taking our time to set out a clear analysis of the challenges and why existing approaches are failing. to understand the questions that matter, to listen hard, to find the answers that work in line with conservative principles, much as, for example, the party was able to achieve in the 1970s with the stepping stones work of John Hoskins and others. And to reach out in this endeavour to the best of our thinkers, businesses, workers, academics, think tanks, charities and others. But let me finally say something else that matters. That no matter what the challenges, we should always recognise that we are a great country with huge underlying strengths in advanced manufacturing, innovation and technology, some of the best universities, our world-class services sector, the City of London, the English language, the rule of law, and so much more. And to those who say we are simply destined ever for the slow lane, that our time has been and gone, that the future lies elsewhere, to them I say there is a better future, and it is worth fighting for. That this is the country of Shakespeare, Nelson, Newton, Turing, Woolf, Nightingale, Austen, Lennon, Crick, punk rock, the jet engine, the internet, graphene and the splitting of the atom. That we will always have within ourselves what it takes to succeed, to build a country that is alive and whole. That is what sustains me as a Conservative. And when other parties are descending into a race to the bottom on economic credibility and responsibility, the Conservative Party is needed now, perhaps more than ever. But to win the fight, we will need thoughtfulness. We will need to take our time if we are to forge a credible plan that delivers for the people of our country. Over the next 4 years, my party will do just that. Thank you. Sorry, I'm in the wrong seat. Yeah, sorry.
Quick seat swap. Thank you, Mel, very much for that. I know there'll be a lot of questions in the room, which we'll get to in a second, along with our friends in the media. But I can't resist, Mel. I spent many happy years when you were head of the Treasury Committee with you pinging questions to me.
This is revenge time.
This is revenge time.
Right, oh God.
I knew the day would come.
I think I was always fair, actually, Andy, to be fair.
Well, you would say that now with the chairs reversed now, wouldn't you? But maybe I could kick off. And can I kick off with all matters fiscal? Clearly central to your speech.
Yeah.
Clearly central to much of the debate about policy right now. And I want to just push you a bit on, to elaborate a little on what you would do differently on the fiscal front to achieve that stability and growth that you spoke about there.
Yeah.
And why it matters.
Okay. Well, I think it matters. The best evidence point for that, I think, would be what I spoke about in terms of what happened in the autumn of 2022. We see what happens when fiscal responsibility goes out the window. We see how markets can react, and we see the real consequence for people in terms of higher interest rates and threats to the economy of a fairly fundamental nature if these things get entirely out of hand. How we're different, I think, is the way I see it, is I think we have a Labour Party today that has taken economic choices that are the wrong choices for our economy and for our financial stability. Those are choices that have led them into taxing businesses very highly, 25 billion on national insurance for employers, for example, which has slowed the economy down, which in turn some of those additional costs have been passed on by way of higher prices, which has pushed up on inflation. We've seen a party in the Labour Party which has borrowed huge amounts of money, gone on a spending spree, which once again has driven up inflation. It's now at 3.5%, well above its 2% target, which incidentally it was bang on the day of the general election. And the consequence of that is it hits people's living standards, but it does something else. It keeps interest rates higher for longer, and that in turn has a knock-on consequence for the cost of servicing our burgeoning national debt, such that the servicing costs at the moment are about 100 billion a year, or twice what we spend on defence. And if you take all of that together and you look at what's happening fiscally in the public finances, the Chancellor blew all her fiscal headroom from the autumn budget of last year and more, and it is almost certain that she's blown the fiscal headroom that she rebuilt in the spring come the autumn, and that's going to lead us into tough decisions probably around additional tax increases. And all of that does not add up to economic or fiscal responsibility. When you look at reform, Reform are operating in a vacuum at the moment. People are fed up with Labour. They've been fed up with us for the reasons that I've just outlined, and they are the none of the above party. And in that circumstance, it's very easy in a very volatile, across a very volatile electorate, to promise a lot of things without there being much scrutiny and to become popular, at least in the short term, as a consequence. And that's why we've got to start to shine the light of truth on what reform is really all about. And to take one example, reform says that they will take everybody earning up to £20,000 out of income tax altogether. The cost of that, according to the IFS, is between 50 and 80 billion pounds. To contextualise that, that is something between about a third and a half of what we spend on the National Health Service with its 1.3 million employees every single year. You have got to have a pretty robust plan on savings or where you're going to find that money if you're going to make that pledge. So I think to your question, Andy, central to this now is there needs to be a party that is absolutely serious about fiscal responsibility, totally gets it, has learnt from the past, and is going to take forward a radical a prospectus for radically rewiring the economy, which is going to take time to put together, in the same way as in the 1970s, between 75 and 79, it took time, but at the same time is never going to lose sight of the fact that fiscal responsibility has to lie right at the centre of what any prospective future government is doing.
So maybe building on that, Mel, if I may, because growth is the great redeemer here.
Yeah.
Many of the challenges we're talking about would be solved at a stroke if we get growth going.
Yeah.
And I sense, I picked it up, a sense of it in your speech as well, of there's a fatalism about growth right now. You know, are we consigned forever to the slow lane on productivity growth?
Yeah.
So are we? And if not, what can be done to get us into the fast lane?
Okay, so we're not consigned to it. There is an argument that says developing countries can grow fast because they've got the potential to do so, more obviously so than mature economies. But if you look at mature economies around the world, Andy, you know, you look at the United States, Canada, France, Germany, they have productivity rates that are about 20% higher than here. And what does that mean? It means if I'm an American worker, I can work from January to August and produce as much output as it takes a British worker to work the whole year to provide. Okay, I have to work for 5 days to do what the other countries are doing in 4. So I think this idea that as we shift from manufacturing maybe into more service-related, mature economies, it's impossible to drive up growth is just simply not substantiated in terms of the facts in respect of our own country. How can we do it? There is no magic bullet. There is, and I tried to convey that. There is no magic bullet. There is no quick lever that you can pull that is suddenly going to transform the economy into a high-growth, high-productivity economy overnight. But let's just touch on some of the strands that feed into that. One is the tax system, not just the size of the tax burden, but the nature of the taxation system, its overcomplication, the question about whether tax leans into growth or not, or has anomalies within almost every tax that actually have cliff edges that mean that people don't go on to be economically active as a consequence of the impact of those taxes. And there are many examples of that to be had. The size of the state. How have we gone from 365,000 civil servants before the pandemic to 515,000 today? That tells you a lot about the bloated nature of the state. Higher education, too many students going to university and not coming out with sufficient value added that it was worth their while economically going there in the first place. As we bring net migration down, we've got to think about expanding the skills base around those markets that are going to be particularly impacted. Welfare, I've mentioned. If you look at the 16 to 64-year-olds who've got a health element to their benefits, if we just kept it where it is now for 5 years, rather than going where the OBR says it's going to go, you save about £15 billion a year, a huge amount. If you took it back to where it was pre-pandemic, you'd save about £30 to £35 billion every single year. You could do huge amounts with that kind of money. And then I won't dwell too much on it, but many supply-side issues, some of which I mentioned, housing. Why is it that Cambridge is restricted in terms of planning and building the laboratories and commercial space that it needs? Because there's no water. Why is there no water? We haven't built a reservoir in this country for 30 years. Why are energy costs too high? How do we get those down? And the final thing I want to say is it's an intergenerational point. Young people in our country feel very left behind. And if you look at social attitudes of 16 to 24-year-olds, many of them do not want to fight for king and country and don't even believe that democracy is the best system of government. That should be deeply frightening to all of us. And we've got to crack this idea of a more inclusive economy that is working for particularly generations, actually right up until about the age of 40, who missed out on the asset inflation around shares and particularly property that you and I would have benefited from, Andy. So that, I suppose, if there's one thing I want to convey here, this is a deep, knotty and very, very difficult challenge. It has many strands to it. We need to get on top of all of them. And the only way we will do that is by doing the hard yards over the coming months and years to come up with the right solutions.
Final quick question from me before we got the audience. So I'm not on social media. No one wants that. But some people did point out there's been some tweeting this morning about your speech already. I'm going to pick a random quote from that tweet. Mel Stride is part of the failed Treasury orthodoxy. That's from L Truss. Which one is it?
Truss, right, OK. Whatever happened to her, I don't know. Yeah, so, look, I think it's very easy, I think, to say, look, there are certain things one could do. For example, there are some that believe, you know, if you just drop taxes left, right and centre, and it all ends up paying for itself and the economy grows and so on and so forth. I don't think that's the right approach. I think there has been huge frustration that's built up that leads to that suggestion that that approach works, and that's built up by decades now of underperformance in the way that I've described in our economy. But the one thing you can never, ever get away from is the bond markets. The one thing you can never take your eye off is having a credible fiscal policy that adds up where you have fully funded everything. Because if you don't do it, you lose control of your economy. And that is the one thing, the overriding message I bring to you today is, yes, we have made mistakes in the past, but we will never, ever repeat them.
Let's get the audience. Mel, thank you for that. And I'll start with Chris down at the front. You want to wait for the mic, Chris?
Thank you. Chris Mason, BBC News. Mel Stride, is what you're saying anywhere near enough when, bluntly, when you look at the opinion polls, it looks like your party is dancing on the trapdoor of oblivion?
So it's not get too carried away by opinion polls 4.5 years from an election, in the way that Pierre Poilievre, who was a shoo-in apparently for the Canadian Prime Ministership, 23% ahead on the polls, I think, just months before that election, not only lost it, but he actually lost his seat. If I was, heaven forbid, a socialist sitting here and it was 2019, your question to me would be, you've just suffered your worst defeat since the 1930s. How on earth do you think you're going to get back in next time around? Look, we're in very volatile times. We have a multi-party system that's emerged, overlaid across a first-past-the-post electoral system, and that means things can move around very quickly. What we have got to do is, through time, demonstrate to the British public, firstly, that we are on their side and will hold this government to account. We've seen a U-turn on winter fuel payments, for example. I think we have substantial ownership of having pushed the government into taking some belatedly correct choices. We must continue to do that. We've got to speak to our values, but we've also got to telegraph the fact that we are serious in the way that I have set out about getting to grips with the fundamental challenges that this country has. And I think that over time, and it won't happen quickly, but over time will be the answer. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I'm going to Catherine Forster at GB News.
Thank you, Catherine Forster, GB News. Shadow Chancellor, you've apologised for what happened under Liz Truss, but you've also admitted that, to use your words, the economy has been languishing in the slow lane since the financial crisis. Now, the Conservatives were in office for 14 of those 17 years. So shouldn't you actually be apologising for your economic record across that whole period?
So I think, thank you for the question. I think I made it clear in my remarks that governments of both colours, and I specifically referenced the Conservative Party in that respect, have failed to get to grips with the underlying challenges that I have set out, and at great cost. So I think you could argue that there are things, particularly in the latter period of our time in office, for example, if you have a worldwide pandemic that shrinks the size of the UK economy by over 10% overnight, you've got to kind of give people a bit of slack to handle that. Similarly, the Ukraine-Russia war and the import of inflation through higher energy costs was a major problem, with inflation spiking at over 10% at the end of 2022. So I think there are things along the way that have been at the very least distractionary and, to be fair, probably of a fundamental kind of challenge. But look, no, I'm not resiling from putting my hand up and saying we needed to have done better across that period in addressing the kind of fundamental things that I've set out.
Thank you. Jason from Daily Mail.
Thanks. You talked about being radical. Can you get taxes down to the pre-pandemic level, or is that ship sailed? And just quickly, with your welfare hat on, what do you make of this idea being floated today of handing back winter fuel payments in a way that may lead to them being clawed back from the estates of the dead?
Okay. So on the welfare point first, Jason, I'm not familiar with this latest twist how these changes may be funded. I would just make the general observation that I think it's absolutely right with winter fuel payments that we shouldn't be paying it to multimillionaires and so on. But at the same time, the nature of the system is so complicated that, in fact, every time you try and exclude them, you end up excluding a lot of people that are very vulnerable and need the support. So, for example, the means testing that the government brought in as one of their first acts in office actually meant that 80% of pensioners below the poverty line ended up missing out on that support and badly needed it. So it's a complicated area, and we need to look at what the government comes forward. In terms of can we get taxes down, absolutely we can get taxes down, but we get taxes down in a responsible way that can be paid for, and we do it by addressing a number of the deep-seated, deep-rooted issues, the size of the state, whether we've got the right skills offer to drive a higher value-added economy, whether we can get energy costs down, whether we can control welfare, and so on and so forth. We will only do it if we have a whole plan that all leans in the same direction. But it can be done. I'll say one more thing about tax. It's not just about the rising tax burden, it's the nature of where the tax burden is actually falling as between individuals and businesses and growth and job creation and so on. And we need to look at every single tax in the context of, is it sufficiently leaning into growth? Are there anomalies in the system which, if we could iron them out, would improve incentives to be productive? So if you take income tax, for example, and I'm not saying everybody's earning £100,000, of course they're not, but if you do reach that level and you're a higher earner, your personal allowance is tapered away over the next 25,000, you end up with very high marginal tax rates. If you're a family with 3 children and you're earning kind of about between 60 and 80, you're losing your child benefit is being tapered away, you end up with marginal tax rates of over 70%. So there are all sorts of interactions between benefits and the way in which the tax system works that actually means people often say, do you know, I've reached this point of effort, I'm going to stop now. So we need to look at the nature of the tax system and its complexities as well as its overall burden.
Very good. I've got Ben from Sky. I don't know what Ben from Sky is. But there he is.
Good morning, Shadow Chancellor. Ben Block, Sky News. Primary aim of your speech today is to put a great deal of distance between yourself, between the Conservative Party of today and one of its former leaders and former Prime Minister, Liz Truss. But surely you don't think everything Liz Truss did was wrong. Can you tell us what you think she did that was right?
So I think what is absolutely right is to recognise that the status quo, for the reasons I've given, is no longer tenable, particularly in a more dangerous world. Putin, Korea, China, a disengagement of America from European security to at least some degree, and who knows where that will end up, a requirement to spend more on defence, for example. That needs a much more strongly growing economy, or we are going to start slipping further and further behind, and we are going to become more fragile and more vulnerable. And I think a recognition of that is absolutely right. There is a way about doing it, and it has to have, at its heart, fiscal responsibility. It has to have an offer. It has to have something that the markets look at where the numbers add up, and that's an important part of the message today. I didn't say that. I said that I recognise that there are many, many important things that we need to do that need to be radical. So we need to have responsible radicalism. Okay, there we are. Maybe that's the takeaway phrase of this morning, responsible radicalism. We certainly need the radicalism, but it's got to be delivered in the right way.
Very good. George. Nice socks, George, by the way.
Nice socks.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, right, yeah.
That's what special cycling socks. Thank you very much, Andy. Question to you, Mel Stride. You haven't set out a great deal of detail on policy this morning, but I'm interested to hear how this feeds into your instincts, what your speech tells us about your instincts. You mentioned the fact the average age of a Conservative voter now is 63. I'd like to know what you have in mind to try to win back that lost generation or even several generations of people who don't even think about voting Conservative. And specifically, how do you defend a policy where you're in favour of a universal winter fuel payment to all people, including richer pensioners, but you're opposed to helping a third child in a poor family through the benefit system?
Okay. So I think let's go for the winter fuel payment and benefits cap first. Okay, I think they're doing very different things. So the winter fuel payment there should be there, in my opinion, to protect those who are extremely vulnerable. As I said, 80% of pensioners below the poverty line lost that payment when it became means tested. I think that is fundamentally wrong, particularly when they had very little notice. The two-child benefit cap, I think there's something else in terms of the principle that's quite distinct and different. And I think that is that in a fair society, we should accept that individuals who are not receiving benefits and have to take the hard choices about whether they have a medium-sized family or whether they have a very large family or large family to a very large family, they often have to really have a long, hard look at whether they can afford to do that. And I don't think it's right, where people are on benefits, that they should naturally not worry about those considerations that other people who are taxpayers are having to consider. So I think there's a difference in the point of principle there. In terms of the lower... Sorry, you had a question on lower tax. Sorry, yes, you said what were my sort of thoughts generally. Well, I think I've kind of set those out, which I think is a state that works and is efficient, is slimmer, a tax system that is broadly lower, more geared towards productivity and producing, a skills sector that is much more aligned to the needs of industry and wealth creation, a welfare system that is there for those that need support and in some cases deserve more support than they're receiving at the moment, but nonetheless is not there as a barrier in and of itself to encouraging people to go into work and engage with employment. And then I think an economy in which things get done, right? So when I joked about the bat hotels and all the rest of it, there's an important point there. You know, we have a society in which there are too many barriers to things actually happening and working. Now, it may be a bat tunnel. It may be that a government policy comes out that saves billions of pounds and is, you know, the right thing to do in the context of the manifesto upon which that party was elected. And yet a judicial review comes along and it sweeps it all away, okay? Or a gateway into a benefit is set by government, elected by the people, and then through various legal challenges gets widened and widened and widened through time until everybody thinks that it's absolutely in the wrong place. So I think lots of things around that. The final thing I would say is about young people. I want to get back to a world that I grew up in, actually. My parents left school at 15 and 14 years old. And I was fortunate. I went to a grammar school. I had a free place. And then I won a place at Oxford University, and it changed my life. And I didn't go through that experience loading myself up with debt. And I ended up with a degree and experience that served me for the rest of my life. It gave me employment opportunities that were really important. And when I left, I set up my own business, working from the kitchen table, getting teams of people together, getting plans sorted out, climbing those metaphorical mountains. And I had Nigel Lawson cutting my taxes and getting red tape out of the way. And we had a zeitgeist that was about entrepreneurship and wealth creation. And I remember that image, the extraordinary image of Thatcher and Branson on that boat going up the River Thames with the sunlight playing on the water like an endless stream of opportunity. And that's what it was like in essence back then. And that's what we've got to get back to. And the final thing is there came a moment where in my hand I had the key to my first property. And it became the foundation for the rest of my life, for the wife who's sitting here, who I was yet to meet, and the family we were yet to create. That is totally alien to young people today. And that is what we have to get back to.
Very good. Jahab.
Thanks. Emilio from Politico. You say never again about the not so mini budget. but that's not really in your gift, in a sense, because you don't know who's going to come in the future. So why shouldn't the Conservative Party change its leadership selecting process so that a very small, very ideological subset of the population, which isn't thinking about responsibility necessarily in the way that you are, stopping that group from picking a future Prime Minister again?
There's no need to change leadership. We've had too many leaders. We've had too many Conservative Prime Ministers chopping and changing.
Not change leadership, but change the process by which they're selected to
avoid
another Liz Truss.
Oh, right, okay. Okay, look, I'm not going to dive in, tempted though I am, into trying to recalibrate or rearrange the election process. But can I just say something about Kemi Badenoch, as you've asked that question? Which is, if you look at the nature of the challenge and the approach to it that I have set out, which is deep thought through time and thoughtfulness, she is the person to lead us, okay? She will get better through time at the media. She will get better through time at the dispatch box at PMQs. Just as Margaret Thatcher, when she became leader in '75, was often criticised for everything from her hair to the clothes she wore to the pitch of her voice to heaven knows what else. In the end, she got it together, and Kemi will do absolutely that. What she is doing behind the scenes is leading a shadow cabinet that is united, and our party has not been united in that way for a very long time. And she is going to drive through the process with me and others so that we come to the right conclusions.
I'm going to take one last question here at the front.
James.
Thank you, Sir Mel. I just wondered, this morning the ONS has apologised for getting inflation figures wrong. I just wondered if any Chancellor of any party can possibly steer the economy correctly when our economic indicators have been proven to be wrong again and again.
I think that's a brilliant question. I think it is thoroughly reprehensible that the ONS on things like the labour market survey data is not able to give more accurate data. The reason, as you will know, is that for too long, actually a short number of years, but nonetheless not a number of weeks or months, it has said that its polling approach is leading to fewer and fewer people actually engaging. So we have much lower sample sizes that drive the kind of lack of veracity of the data itself. I don't think that's acceptable, actually, and I'm surprised that it's been allowed to persist for as long as it has. If I were still the chair of the Treasury Select Committee, they would most definitely, quite a while ago, have been hauled before me to start explaining exactly why that has happened.
Mel, could I end, or try to end on a note of optimism? A lot today about what's gone wrong and why it's gone wrong, and a very pervasive sense, domestically, globally, of uncertainty about the future. But of course, the flip of uncertainty is opportunity. So I wondered, in ending, whether you could lift our eyes to some sunny uplands.
Yeah.
And tell us a story about how Britain could be, and how we tell a story about ourselves that is uplifting, that is optimistic, and isn't confined to London, to Westminster, but spreads across all four corners of the UK. Good luck.
There is exactly that world. It's not easy to get to there, as I think I've set out. But what it would look like, Andy, is an economy that is growing much, much faster, can do much more for its citizens, can address things like intergenerational fairness, can make sure that younger people feel they've got a slice of it too, can provide for our elderly, can resolve the issues around social care and the demography of our country that's going to an ever more elderly population. And I think more broadly than that, can see us holding our head high in the world and leading other nations. For example, leading in Europe when it comes to our defence and our security, and exporting and championing British values that have been there for centuries around free speech and enterprise and all the great things that we've brought to the world, and avoid that sort of sense of being continuously eclipsed because we're sliding down a slope of ever poorer performance. It is there, but we're going to have to get back to my age of thoughtfulness. Everybody's got to start really asking the questions as to what's realistic and how we can go about getting there. And if we do that, then we can do it.
It's a great way to end. Listen, thank you all for coming along. You've all been very well behaved. You can come again. This place has been around for 271 years. It was put on earth to have debates like this, and the debates are big, and the trade-offs are real, and so too will be after the big choices. And thank you, Mel, for setting out some of those choices today. Please join me in thanking Sir Mel Stride.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks, Ahmed. Thank you.